In the dim light of a 1930s New York alley, the silhouette of a man known only as Lucky moves like smoke, precise, confident, untouchable. The city hums around him, jazz leaking from speakeasies, the rattle of subway trains below, and the distant echo of police sirens slicing through the night. To most, Charles "Lucky" Luciano was the face of organized crime, a cold, calculating mob boss who built an empire on vice. But to those who lived within his world, he was something more. A visionary who imposed order on chaos, a leader who gave criminals a code when all they had before was blood and fear. This is not just a story about crime. It's a story about power, how it's built, maintained, and inevitably lost. It's about how one man, forged by poverty, violence, and ambition, redefined what it meant to be a gangster in America. Luciano didn't invent organized crime, but he turned it into a system. Before him, the Mafia was a series of warring clans, each driven by ego, revenge, and superstition. After him, it became an institution, efficient, disciplined, and ruthlessly pragmatic. The code he built wasn't just one of silence. It was one of structure, respect, and psychological control. As the documentary opens, we enter a world of contradictions, where loyalty coexists with betrayal, and morality is a matter of perspective. Luciano understood these contradictions better than anyone. To him, honor wasn't about righteousness, it was about stability. He believed that even criminals needed rules, not to make them good men but to make them powerful ones. This belief became his guiding principle, his code of honor, and it would define every decision he made. It was a philosophy that allowed him to transform crime into a corporation, turning the chaos of the streets into a network of loyalty and profit. Yet beneath the legend of Lucky Luciano lies a man shaped by survival. He wasn't born powerful. He was born poor, vulnerable, and often afraid. The streets of New York didn't offer him choices, only consequences. Every friend he made could become a rival, and every deal was a test of trust. What set Luciano apart was his ability to think long-term in a world addicted to quick gains. He played the game like a chess master, always several moves ahead. He knew when to charm, when to bribe, and when to kill, but most importantly, when not to. The opening scene of this story is not in a courtroom or a back alley, but in the psychology of a man who saw crime not as rebellion, but as organization. He was not a brute, though he commanded killers. He was not a saint, though he preached loyalty. He was the embodiment of the American contradiction, the immigrant who achieved the dream through corruption, the outsider who became the system. In the smoky backrooms of Manhattan's most infamous clubs, Luciano's voice carried weight without volume. "Do business, not war," he would say, a simple phrase that became the foundation of his empire. To his associates he was more than a boss, he was the architect of a new order. But like every empire built on human ambition, his would eventually face its reckoning. Power never lasts, and even the sharpest minds can't escape the gravity of betrayal. As we journey through this story, we'll explore how Luciano's code, part honor, part manipulation, became both his greatest weapon and his ultimate downfall. We'll walk through the shadowy alleys of New York's underworld, the smoky meetings of the Commission, the silent prisons of his exile, and the echo of his legacy that still haunts organized crime today. Lucky Luciano's story isn't just about the Mafia. It's about America, a place where ambition is celebrated no matter the cost, where loyalty is currency and betrayal is inevitable. It's about how power reshapes morality and how one man's rules could define an era. By the time we reach the end of his journey, one truth will stand clear. Luciano didn't just build an empire. He built a code. And that code, born of necessity, sharpened by intellect, and corrupted by greed, would change the world forever. Before Lucky Luciano's rise, New York City was a battlefield disguised as a metropolis, a place where ambition outpaced morality, and every street corner belonged to someone with a gun and a grudge. The early 20th century was a time of explosive growth and deep division. Immigrants from Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe poured into the city, chasing opportunity but finding only sweatshops, tenements, and corruption. In these crowded blocks, survival wasn't about who worked the hardest, but who controlled the fear. And fear in those days had a name: the gangs. The Mafia that would later dominate America did not yet exist in any organized form. Instead, the criminal world was a chaotic mosaic of ethnic enclaves. The Irish ran the docks and the police. The Jews controlled the underworld's finances, gambling, and bootlegging networks. And the Italians, the Sicilians, Neapolitans, and Calabrians, fought among themselves, divided by dialects, regions, and ancient grudges. They brought with them the traditions of the Onorata Società, the honored society of Sicily, But in America, those old codes were warped by greed and urban violence. In the little Italies of Manhattan and Brooklyn, the first mafia bosses were men like Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, old-world gangsters who clung to Sicilian ritual as both armor and weapon. They ruled with superstition and blood, demanding loyalty not through respect but through fear. Every meeting required a kiss on the hand. Every oath was sealed in blood. To disobey meant death, and to question tradition was unthinkable. Their world was bound by symbols: the saint's medallion, the whispered prayer, the dagger hidden beneath a coat. But beneath the ceremony lay chaos. This old order thrived on violence and ignorance. The mustache Petes, as the younger generation called them, were trapped in an outdated code that valued family lineage over intelligence. They refused to work with non-Italians, seeing them as outsiders unworthy of trust. In doing so, they limited their reach, their empires small, their ambitions smaller. The gangs fought constantly for turf, their wars spilling into the streets and newspapers, leaving bodies in alleys and headlines that terrified the public. Each boss saw himself as a king, but none had a vision beyond his block. Meanwhile, America itself was changing. Prohibition had transformed crime into big business. With alcohol outlawed in 1920, the demand for bootleg liquor created a black market gold rush. Money flowed faster than ever before, and with it came the realization that brute force alone couldn't control it. Success required organization, discretion, and strategy. The problem was that the old mafia didn't understand business, it only understood power. Enter a new kind of gangster, the Americanized criminal. He wore tailored suits instead of peasant jackets, spoke fluent English and treated the underworld like an enterprise. The Jewish syndicates, led by men like Arnold Rothstein and later Meyer Lansky, understood numbers, logistics, and opportunity. They didn't care about tradition, only profit. Their operations ran smoothly, their network spread efficiently, and their loyalty was built on business, not blood. This contrast between old-world ritual and new-world pragmatism set the stage for revolution. The young Italian gangsters, men like Luciano, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese, watched the Irish and Jewish mobs thrive through cooperation and began to question their own elders' methods. Why fight wars over family names when you could divide cities like markets? Why cling to secrecy when you could form alliances? For them, honor wasn't about heritage anymore, it was about success. Still, the mustache Petes held power. Joe Masuria, the self-proclaimed boss of bosses, ruled the Italian underworld through intimidation and arrogance. He demanded tribute from every gang, even those outside his control. His rival, Maranzano, claimed to be the true Caesar of the mafia, obsessed with modeling his criminal empire on ancient Rome. Their feud, known as the Castellamarese War, would soon plunge the city into bloodshed. Hundreds died, loyalty meant nothing, and paranoia consumed the streets. The police were outmatched. The courts were corrupt. Politicians took bribes while newspapers fed the public stories of mysterious murders and foreign gangsters. To the average New Yorker, the mafia was a shadow army, unstoppable and everywhere. But inside the underworld, it was far from invincible. It was disorganized, inefficient, and bleeding itself to death. It was in this chaos that Lucky Luciano saw his opportunity. He understood what the old men didn't, that the future belonged to those who could think like businessmen, not warlords. The mafia didn't need more soldiers, it needed a system. Luciano watched as the mustache Petes destroyed each other and realized that their weakness was their pride. They fought for dominance, he would fight for control. They wanted respect, he wanted order. By the end of the 1920s, the mafia's old guard was rotting from within. The streets were tired of endless vendettas. The younger generation whispered about change, about rules that made sense in America, not Sicily. In the smoke-filled backrooms of Manhattan speakeasies, plans began to take shape. The underworld was ready for something new, a crime empire built not on superstition but on structure. When Luciano finally rose to power, he would inherit a world of violence and disunity. But unlike the men before him, he wouldn't waste it. He would mold it into something enduring, something almost civilized. Before the code of honor came the chaos, and before the empire came the ashes of those who refused to evolve. New York, restless and corrupt, was waiting for a man like Lucky Luciano to give its darkness purpose. The story of Lucky Luciano truly begins long before the glimmer of Manhattan's skyline ever reflected in his eyes, in a small Sicilian town called Lercara Fritti, near Palermo. It was there, on November 24, 1897, that Salvatore Lucania was born into a life that offered almost nothing and demanded everything. His father Antonio was a sulfur miner, a profession that meant long hours, low pay and no future. His mother, Rosalia, raised her children with stern devotion, trying to instill in them the same Catholic discipline that had kept generations of Sicilians alive through poverty. But Sicily at the turn of the century was not a place for dreams. It was a place where boys learned early that power came not from honesty, but from control, of land, of money, and of men. In 1906, when Salvatore was 9 years old, the Lucania family packed what little they owned and boarded a ship bound for America. Like thousands of Sicilians before them, they believed New York was a land of opportunity, a place where hard work could lift them out of poverty. But when they arrived, they found the same desperation, just dressed differently. They settled in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, one of the most overcrowded neighborhoods in the world. Tenements stacked families like boxes, alleys stank of garbage and sweat. Life was survival, and survival was a business. It was in these streets that Salvatore became Charlie. He Americanized his name to fit in, but he never forgot where he came from. As a child, he watched men argue in the streets, saw fights over pennies, and learned that in America, as in Sicily, respect was the only real currency. By the age of 10, he was running errands for older boys who belonged to small neighborhood gangs. By 14, he had quit school entirely, choosing the hustle over the classroom. His first lessons weren't taught by teachers. They were learned in alleys, on corners, in whispered deals. The Lower East Side was a melting pot of ambition and hunger. Jewish immigrants, Irish dockworkers, Italian laborers, all competing for the same scraps. Street gangs became families, and those families gave boys like Charlie identity and protection. He quickly learned that fighting wasn't the only way to win. Sometimes a smile and a favor were worth more than a fist. That instinct, to build alliances instead of enemies, would become his greatest strength. As a teenager, Charlie began to run with a group called the 5 Points Gang, led by the notorious Paul Kelly, Paolo Vaccarelli. Kelly wasn't a brute, he was a strategist, a gangster who dressed like a businessman and thought like a politician. Under Kelly's guidance, young Luciano was exposed to a new kind of underworld, one that valued brains over brawn. Kelly taught him the art of diplomacy, how to negotiate with rivals, and how to handle law enforcement with charm instead of violence. These were lessons that would shape Luciano's entire philosophy. During these years, Charlie also met two young men who would define his life, Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Lansky, the quiet Jewish math prodigy with a gift for numbers, complemented Luciano's charisma perfectly. Siegel, fearless and volatile, became his enforcer and closest friend. Together they formed an unlikely trio, an Italian, a Jew and a madman, united not by heritage but by ambition. In a time when ethnic lines divided the criminal world, their friendship was revolutionary. The streets taught Luciano everything formal education couldn't: psychology, economics, and survival. He learned how to read people, to spot weakness, to sense fear, to understand what drove men. "Everyone wants something," he would later say. "You just have to find out what it is." He used this insight to manipulate situations to his advantage, building small networks of influence. He organized street games, controlled small-time gambling, and by his early 20s, was already known to the police as a rising figure in the Italian mob scene. The Prohibition era, which began in 1920, offered Luciano his first taste of real power. The demand for illegal alcohol turned petty hustlers into millionaires overnight. Luciano saw the opportunity immediately. While others saw danger, he saw business. He aligned himself with major bootleggers, using his multilingual background to broker deals between Italian, Jewish, and Irish gangs. For the first time, he began to see the outlines of something bigger, a criminal network that could function like a corporation. But even as he rose, Luciano never forgot the dangers of the streets. He was arrested numerous times for minor offenses, possession, assault, bootlegging, but each time he used connections or bribes to slip free. His nickname, Lucky, came from his uncanny ability to survive everything thrown at him, from police raids to assassination attempts. Yet it wasn't pure luck. It was intelligence. He knew when to disappear, when to pay off, and when to make a deal. Then came 1929, the year that would change him forever. One night, after leaving a nightclub, Luciano was kidnapped, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead on a Staten Island beach. His face was mutilated, his body broken. No one ever discovered exactly who did it. Some said it was rival gangsters, others claimed it was corrupt cops, but Luciano survived. The attack left a permanent scar on his face and a deeper one on his psyche. When he looked in the mirror afterward, he no longer saw the ambitious street kid. He saw the man who would never be a victim again. That near-death experience crystallized his worldview. From that day forward, Luciano operated without fear. He understood that the underworld was not about brute strength, it was about control. Over people, over systems, and over oneself. The streets had taught him cunning, the beating taught him ruthlessness. He began to see the mafia not as a gang, but as a machine that could be re-engineered, a hierarchy without chaos, a brotherhood without superstition. By the time the 1930s dawned, Lucky Luciano was no longer a street hustler. He was a strategist with ambition far greater than any boss before him. The boy from the Sicilian mines had become the architect of something unprecedented. A vision of organized crime that transcended borders, languages, and traditions. He was ready to turn the underworld into an empire. But before he could build it, he would have to destroy the old one. The transformation from Charles Luciano, the ambitious street hustler, to Lucky Luciano, the architect of the American Mafia, didn't happen overnight. It was a process, one defined by calculated alliances, relentless ambition, and a new way of thinking about crime itself. In the Prohibition years, money flowed like bootleg whiskey, and every criminal in New York was chasing it. But while most saw only the next deal, Luciano was already imagining a system that could outlast any individual. He didn't just want to make money, he wanted to control how everyone else made theirs. He began by choosing his friends wisely. Meyer Lansky, the quiet mathematical genius, became his brain trust. Lansky understood money and risk in ways few men did, and he shared Luciano's belief that business, not blood, should drive the underworld. Bugsy Siegel, wild and fearless, was the muscle, unpredictable but loyal, a man who could strike fear into anyone who crossed them. Frank Costello, smooth-talking and politically connected, completed the inner circle. Together they represented something revolutionary, a multi-ethnic alliance bound not by heritage but by profit. This coalition gave Luciano a perspective that set him apart from the old-school Italian bosses. The mustache Pete still treated outsiders with suspicion, refusing to trust Jews or Irishmen. Luciano saw the flaw in that logic. The world had changed, America had changed, and the future belonged to those who could adapt. He began working with everyone who could help his cause, regardless of their ethnicity. To him, money didn't care about bloodlines. That mindset, heretical to traditional mobsters, became the cornerstone of his empire. By the late 1920s, Luciano had earned a reputation as both charming and coldly strategic. He could talk business with politicians in the morning and dine with killers at night. He wore tailored suits, spoke with calm authority, and understood the value of image. Unlike his mentors, he didn't crave public fear, he craved quiet respect. In an era when most gangsters ruled with brutality, Luciano ruled with psychology. He knew that real power wasn't about making people afraid of dying, it was about making them afraid of disappointing you. His rise was not without cost. The more he gained influence, the more enemies he made. Older bosses like Joe Masuria saw Luciano's modern ideas as dangerous, even blasphemous. Masuria, known as Joe the Boss, demanded total obedience and tribute from every Italian gangster in New York. Luciano publicly complied, but privately he grew restless. He saw that Masuria's arrogance was dragging the mafia into ruin. His obsession with dominance blinded him to opportunity, and his refusal to modernize kept the mafia fractured. Luciano, meanwhile, was building quiet connections behind the scenes. He maintained friendly relations with rival gangs, including Jewish mobsters like Lansky's associates and Dutch Schultz's crew. He observed how their operations ran more like corporations than street gangs, structured, disciplined, efficient. That model fascinated him. He began thinking of the mafia as a potential network, not just a hierarchy. If organized correctly, crime could function like business. Departments for gambling, bootlegging, prostitution, and unions, all feeding money up through a central command. But it was the near-fatal attack of 1929 that turned his vision into determination. The scars left on his face became a kind of armor, a daily reminder of survival and vengeance. From that point on, he stopped following orders. The man who once sought acceptance from old-world bosses decided to outlive and outthink them instead. He began planning for a world after the Mustache Pete's, one where the mafia would no longer be a relic of Sicily, but a modern American syndicate. Luciano's defining trait wasn't ruthlessness, it was patience. He never rushed moves. He waited for the right moment, the right alliance, the right betrayal. And when the time came, he would strike not out of rage but precision. Every handshake, every favor, every conversation was part of a long game that would end with him at the top. By the dawn of the 1930s, Luciano stood on the edge of transformation. He had the brains, the muscle, and the money, but most importantly he had the vision. The old world was fading, the new one was forming, and lucky Luciano was ready to write its rules. The boy who had once run errands for street gangs now sat at the center of an empire in waiting, one built not on chaos but on code. The old guard of the Mafia believed in a simple truth: power belonged to the past. Men like Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano ruled the Italian underworld through fear and ritual. They were products of Sicily, men bound by superstition, hierarchy, and blood. To them, America was merely another territory to conquer, not a place to evolve. But by the early 1930s that old-world arrogance was cracking, and the man holding the hammer was Lucky Luciano. The tension between the generations wasn't just about money, it was about philosophy. The Mustache Petes saw themselves as aristocrats of crime, gatekeepers of a sacred tradition that could not be questioned. They refused to adapt to the modern world, believing that Sicilian customs and blind loyalty would protect them. They despised the younger, American-born Italians who dressed like businessmen and associated with Jews and Irishmen. To them, men like Luciano were traitors to their heritage. But Luciano saw them as relics, men clinging to obsolete values in a city that was changing faster than they could comprehend. The clash reached its breaking point during the Castellamarese War, a bloody power struggle between Masuria and Maranzano that consumed New York's underworld from 1929 to 1931. It wasn't just a war for control, it was a civil war between the old world and the new. The streets ran red as loyalties shifted daily, assassinations became routine, and the city's alleys turned into graveyards. Businesses suffered, profits vanished, and the police, overwhelmed and corrupt, barely tried to intervene. Luciano, then Masuria's protégé, watched the senseless bloodshed with growing disgust. He realized that both sides were doomed, trapped in a cycle of revenge that would destroy them all. The old men fought for honor, Luciano wanted efficiency. While Masuria and Maranzano clung to the idea of one supreme boss of bosses, Luciano envisioned something entirely different: a democracy of crime, a network that could sustain peace through shared power. But to build that vision he had to survive the war, and that meant playing both sides. Luciano became a master of deception. He feigned loyalty to Masuria while quietly reaching out to Maranzano. He presented himself as a dutiful soldier to the old guard, even as he quietly planned their extinction. His strategy wasn't driven by hatred, it was driven by logic. The Mafia couldn't thrive under tyranny. It needed structure, not ego. In April 1931, Luciano made his decisive move. He arranged a meeting with Masuria at a Coney Island restaurant, inviting him to lunch. As they played cards, Luciano excused himself to the bathroom. Moments later, 4 gunmen, reportedly including Bugsy Siegel and Vito Genovese, burst in and gunned down Masuria. When Luciano returned, he found his mentor dead, a playing card still clutched in his hand. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The game had changed and the new player had just taken the table. With Masuria gone, Maranzano assumed control, proclaiming himself the new Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of bosses. For a moment, Luciano appeared loyal. He accepted a position as Maranzano's second-in-command, learning everything about his new empire. But it didn't take long for him to see that Maranzano was no different from the man he'd just killed. He dressed in fine suits, quoted Julius Caesar, and ran the Mafia like a Roman Empire. He divided the city into provinces, demanded tribute from every family, and filled his meetings with speeches about loyalty and purity. To the young generation it was absurd, a dangerous nostalgia dressed as leadership. Luciano realized that if Maranzano remained in power, he'd simply replace one dictator with another. The dream of a modern, business-minded mafia would die before it began. And so, once again, Luciano chose evolution over obedience. He secretly ordered Maranzano's assassination, an act that would forever redefine the mafia's structure. In September 1931, Maranzano was stabbed and shot to death in his Park Avenue office by a team of Jewish hitmen disguised as government agents. The old guard was finished. With both Masuria and Maranzano gone, Luciano finally stood at the center of the underworld. But he didn't declare himself king. Instead, he abolished the very title that had caused so much bloodshed. There would be no more boss of bosses. In its place, he established a new system, a council of equals known as the Commission. Each major family would have representation, and decisions would be made collectively. It was a revolutionary idea: shared power to prevent war, stability to ensure profit. This was the moment the Mafia stopped being a collection of rival gangs and became a true organization. Luciano replaced superstition with structure, fear with respect, and tradition with efficiency. The old guard's obsession with lineage was replaced by his simple creed, make money not war. Psychologically, this was the moment Luciano separated himself from the world that made him. He had been born under the Sicilian code of silence, loyalty, and revenge, but he'd reshaped those principles into tools of management. His honor wasn't rooted in heritage, it was rooted in results. He understood people, their desires and fears, and he used that understanding to command loyalty through logic instead of terror. When the dust settled, the Mafia entered a new age. The mustache Petes were dead or retired, their world buried with them. The city's criminal landscape was reborn, sleek, structured, and profitable. The code of honor had evolved. It was no longer about avenging slights or preserving old-world pride. Under Lucky Luciano, it became something colder and smarter, a disciplined system of order built to last. When Lucky Luciano looked out over the New York underworld in the early 1930s, he saw not chaos but potential. The street wars were over, the old guard was gone, and for the first time in history, there was a chance to rebuild crime itself, not as a series of gangs but as an organization. His genius wasn't just in eliminating rivals, it was in seeing what no one else could. That power, when structured properly, could be self-sustaining. The Mafia didn't need to live and die by violence. It could operate like a corporation, disciplined, profitable, and eternal. To make that vision real, Luciano introduced his greatest innovation, the Commission. This governing body, established in 1931, was unlike anything the criminal world had ever seen. Its purpose was simple, to end the constant bloodshed between families and replace it with a council of balance. Each major Mafia family would have a seat, its boss serving as both a representative and a shareholder in the grand syndicate. No one man would rule, decisions would be made collectively. Disputes would be settled through vote, not murder. It was democracy, the Mafia's version of it. The idea was radical. For decades, the Mafia had operated under the rule of the Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of bosses, a title that demanded obedience and inspired endless rebellion. Luciano abolished it. He saw that no empire built on ego could survive. Instead, he created a system where ambition could thrive within structure. Every boss was powerful but accountable. Every territory was autonomous but connected. Violence became policy, not instinct. The commission was made up of the most influential families. Luciano's own organization, which would later become the Genovese family, the families led by Joe Bonanno, Tommy Gagliano, Vincent Mangano, and Stefano Megadino. Al Capone's Chicago outfit was given representation as well, ensuring national unity. Luciano's friend and strategist Frank Costello acted as political liaison, maintaining relationships with judges, cops, and politicians who ensured that the machine kept running smoothly. Meyer Lansky, though not officially part of the commission due to his Jewish heritage, was its invisible architect, advising Luciano on finance, risk, and structure. This was the birth of organized crime as America came to know it. Under Luciano's design, the Mafia became a network of interlocking businesses. Each family specialized in certain operations, gambling, labor racketeering, loan sharking, or smuggling, and shared profits through coordinated ventures. Violence, once the tool of dominance, became a last resort. Killings were authorized only when necessary, and unauthorized murders could result in execution. Luciano enforced these rules with precision. To him, the Mafia wasn't a criminal fraternity anymore. It was an economy. The transformation was psychological as much as structural. Luciano understood that men needed more than fear to stay loyal, they needed purpose. He offered them identity, a sense of belonging to something greater than themselves. To be part of the commission meant power, respect, and security. It was the illusion of order in a world of lawlessness, and men followed it with religious devotion. But Luciano's brilliance wasn't confined to organization, it extended to vision. He saw beyond New York. He wanted to unify crime across America. Through alliances with figures like Frank Nitti in Chicago, Mo Dalitz in Cleveland, and Lansky's gambling networks in Florida and Cuba, Luciano began weaving a national syndicate. Trucks that carried whiskey across state lines, casinos that laundered money through legitimate fronts, even shipping lines that smuggled narcotics from Europe, all of it fell under his unseen control. At the heart of it all was his philosophy: crime is business. He treated the underworld like Wall Street. Territories were markets, gangsters were managers, and violence was a cost to be minimized. He instituted rules of conduct that mirrored corporate principles. No interference in other families' business. No open wars. No direct attacks on law enforcement or politicians. Discretion became the new definition of strength. Luciano also understood optics. He realized that the mafia's power depended on invisibility. Unlike Capone, who flaunted his wealth and invited public outrage, Luciano operated quietly. He cultivated a respectable image, investing in nightclubs, real estate, and entertainment. To the public, he was a well-dressed businessman. To those who knew better, he was the invisible hand guiding everything from the docks to the casinos. Still, beneath this newfound order lay a paradox. Luciano's system promised peace, but it was built on blood. Every rule he created was enforced through fear, a fear more psychological than physical. Disloyalty wasn't just punished, it was erased. Men vanished without trace. Informants became examples. The commission's meetings were cordial, but beneath every handshake lurked the knowledge that betrayal meant death. Luciano had replaced chaos with control, but control always comes at a cost. The commission's power extended beyond the underworld. Through Costello's political connections, bribes flowed to police departments, judges, and union leaders. Politicians, desperate for funding during the Depression, took mafia money in exchange for silence. City contracts were influenced, labor strikes manipulated, and entire industries, from construction to shipping, subtly absorbed into the mob's economic ecosystem. The mafia had gone corporate, and its influence reached from the back alleys of New York to the marble halls of Washington. To the men who served under him, Luciano was both a boss and a symbol. He was calm, deliberate, and always one step ahead. He didn't shout orders or demand obedience. He persuaded, reasoned, and controlled with charm. That psychological mastery made him unique. Even his enemies respected him, and feared him. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's vision had reshaped the criminal world. The endless wars of the past were over, replaced by an uneasy but functional peace. For the first time, the mafia had rules that allowed it to expand into every corner of American life without self-destructing. The commission had become the silent government of the underworld, and its architect, Lucky Luciano, stood at the center, calm, untouchable, and supremely confident. He had done what no one else had managed, turned crime into a system and chaos into order. But systems, no matter how perfect, always breed their own enemies. The world outside was changing. Law enforcement was adapting, the public was growing restless, and the seeds of downfall were already being planted. For now, though, Luciano was king of a kingdom built not on fear alone, but on the brilliance of design. For all his genius in organization, Lucky Luciano understood that every empire, no matter how disciplined, is ultimately made up of men. And men, unlike systems, have emotions: pride, envy, and ambition. These were the true threats to his empire, the quiet fault lines running beneath the polished structure he had built. In the underworld of the 1930s, alliances were like loaded guns, useful when aimed in the same direction, fatal when turned inward. Luciano's closest circle was a delicate balance of loyalty and latent tension. Frank Costello, his partner in diplomacy, was the calm strategist, a man who preferred cigars and conversation to violence. Meyer Lansky, his financial architect, provided the brains that legitimized the operation. Together, they formed the rational spine of the organization. But not everyone in the mafia thought like them. There were men whose loyalty depended on blood, not logic, old-school bosses who saw Luciano's reforms as betrayal of Sicilian tradition. Among those was Joe Bonanno, the young, calculating boss of one of the 5 families. Bonanno admired Luciano's intelligence but never fully trusted him. He came from a generation that valued silence, family honor, and hierarchy over business innovation. To him, Luciano's inclusion of Jewish and Irish associates was sacrilege, a dilution of mafia purity. The same unease simmered in men like Vincent Mangano and Tommy Gagliano, who saw the commission not as a council of peace, but as a mechanism that centralized too much power in Luciano's hands. And then there were the true threats, men like Albert Anastasia and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Anastasia, the so-called Lord High Executioner, was a killer without hesitation, fiercely loyal to Luciano but dangerously volatile. Siegel, Lansky's childhood friend, was charismatic, daring, and reckless, the kind of man who could charm anyone, then shoot them an hour later. Together, they represented the mafia's dual nature: intelligence and violence, calculation and chaos. Luciano knew how to use both, but he also knew that men like Anastasia and Siegel could never be fully controlled. The commission, though designed to prevent wars, didn't eliminate rivalries, it simply institutionalized them. Each family had its own interests, its own grievances. Decisions required consensus, and consensus in a room full of gangsters was an illusion. Behind every vote, there were secret deals, whispered threats, and unspoken debts. Luciano played the room like a chessboard, anticipating moves before they happened. But even the best player can't predict every piece. One of the most dangerous rivalries began to brew with Dutch Schultz, a Jewish gangster who controlled a vast empire of bootlegging, gambling, and racketeering. Schultz was brilliant but unhinged, a man whose greed often overrode reason. When he came under federal investigation for tax evasion, Schultz proposed assassinating the prosecutor, Thomas E. Dewey, the same man who would later play a pivotal role in Luciano's downfall. Luciano was horrified. Killing a federal prosecutor wasn't just reckless, it would bring national attention to the mafia's operations. The commission unanimously voted against the hit. Schultz ignored them. Luciano had no choice. To maintain order, he authorized Schultz's elimination, not out of malice but necessity. The execution, carried out by the infamous Murder Incorporated, was brutal and efficient. Schultz's death sent a message across the underworld. The commission's word was law. No one, no matter how powerful, could act independently. It was a defining moment in Luciano's leadership, the first time the mafia had disciplined one of its own to preserve the greater system. But while the external threats were handled, internal tensions began to fester. The more Luciano centralized power, the more resentment grew among the older bosses. They saw him as a dictator in disguise, a man who spoke of equality while quietly pulling every string. His control over the unions, the narcotics trade, and the politicians gave him influence that dwarfed his peers. They began to whisper, was the boss of bosses title truly gone, or had Luciano simply reinvented it? Meanwhile, his relationship with Meyer Lansky deepened. The two men shared a rare kind of understanding, intellectual partnership built on mutual respect. Lansky's Jewish background kept him outside the mafia's official structure, but Luciano treated him as an equal. Together, they began expanding operations into legitimate enterprises, casinos in Cuba, smuggling routes in the Caribbean, and investment fronts in Manhattan real estate. It was a vision that extended far beyond the criminal, a hybrid world where legality and illegality intertwined so seamlessly that no law could separate them. But success breeds visibility, and visibility breeds enemies. Federal agents began paying closer attention to the mysterious Lucky Luciano, whose name whispered through nightclubs and union halls alike. Journalists wrote of an invisible empire, one that seemed to control everything yet had no face. Luciano's careful anonymity was starting to erode. Inside the mafia, jealousy and fear began to circulate like a virus. Men who once praised him now questioned his motives. Among the most unpredictable elements was Vito Genovese, Luciano's ambitious lieutenant. Genovese admired Luciano's power but coveted it for himself. While Luciano built alliances and avoided unnecessary killings, Genovese believed in domination through fear. He saw diplomacy as weakness, compromise as cowardice. To him, Luciano's reliance on Lansky and Costello was a betrayal of Sicilian tradition, an infection that needed cleansing. Quietly, he began to position himself as Luciano's eventual successor, manipulating subordinates, and building his own loyal faction. The underworld's peace began to tremble. The same code that once held it together, omerta, respect, and unity, started to fracture under greed and suspicion. Luciano had given the mafia structure, but he couldn't rewrite human nature. Every alliance, no matter how strategic, carried the seed of betrayal. By the late 1930s, cracks in Luciano's empire were visible to those who looked closely enough. Law enforcement was tightening its grip, informants were whispering in dark corners, and the commission's unity began to look more like a truce than a partnership. Luciano, always perceptive, felt the shift. He had built a machine too big to control, a system that operated even when he wasn't watching. And within that system, ambition was always hungry. Yet despite the storm gathering around him, Luciano remained calm. He hosted dinners, attended meetings, and continued to speak softly, the way he always had. His strength lay in his composure, in the illusion that nothing could touch him. But in truth, the empire he built was entering its most fragile phase. Allies were becoming rivals. Rivals were turning into enemies. And in the shadow of the commission's success, the first faint outlines of Luciano's downfall were beginning to take shape. By the late 1930s, the calm facade of Lucky Luciano's empire began to crack. What had once been an elegant system of order and balance was slowly descending into a shadow war, not just between rival families but between the mafia and a new kind of enemy, the American justice system. Luciano had spent years mastering men, manipulating unions, and buying silence. But now the silence was breaking. A new kind of war was emerging. One fought not with bullets but with investigations, headlines, and public outrage. Thomas E. Dewey, the ambitious special prosecutor for New York, was the face of that war. Young, intelligent, and unyielding, Dewey represented everything Luciano couldn't buy: moral conviction and political ambition. Dewey saw the Mafia not as a criminal organization to dismantle, but as a disease infecting the heart of the city. He made it his mission to expose it root by root. Luciano, for his part, underestimated him at first. He had survived police raids, gang wars, and even internal coups. A politician seemed like just another opponent to outmaneuver. But Dewey wasn't just any opponent. He was the first to understand that Luciano's true weapon wasn't violence, but structure. The first blows in this hidden war came quietly. Dewey's office began targeting prostitution rings in Manhattan. Operations that, on the surface, seemed small-time and disconnected from organized crime. But as investigators followed the money, they discovered something shocking. The profits led upward, through layers of managers and collectors, directly to Luciano's network. What began as a raid on brothels was about to become the most significant attack ever launched against the Mafia's leadership. Luciano, meanwhile, was living like a businessman. He split his time between the Waldorf Astoria and various nightclubs, hosting entertainers, politicians, and businessmen. To the public, he was a wealthy entrepreneur, always well-dressed, soft-spoken, and polite. He didn't carry guns or issue orders in backrooms anymore. His authority was invisible, executed through layers of trusted lieutenants. That invisibility had always been his shield. But Dewey's investigators were peeling it away, piece by piece. Inside the organization, paranoia began to grow. The raids were too precise, the arrests too coordinated. Someone was talking. Luciano's men began interrogating their own, looking for the leak. They beat suspects, threatened women, and paid off witnesses. But Dewey's case only grew stronger. For the first time, the Mafia's greatest fear was coming true: exposure. The underworld had always thrived in darkness. Now, with newspapers splashing stories about Vice King Luciano across their front pages, the empire's foundations began to shake. Dewey played the media masterfully, using the public's outrage to fuel his crusade. Headlines turned Luciano from a shadowy legend into a tangible villain, a man who profited off exploitation and corruption. The myth of the untouchable gangster was dying under the glare of the spotlight. Luciano's response was strategic, not violent. He ordered his men to lay low, cut back operations, and bribe anyone who could slow Dewey's progress. He even considered fleeing the country temporarily. But it was too late. Dewey's office had already secured the cooperation of key witnesses, women from the brothels who had been beaten, threatened, and humiliated by Luciano's enforcers. They testified in detail about how money was collected, who gave orders, and where it went. The evidence pointed to one man at the top. Behind the scenes, Meyer Lansky urged caution. He knew that fighting Dewey head-on would only make things worse. "You can't shoot a prosecutor," he told Luciano. "You have to outlast him." But time was running out. Each day brought new arrests, new witnesses, new leaks. Even Luciano's allies on the commission began distancing themselves. Men who had once toasted to his health now avoided his name entirely. There was also tension within his own ranks. Vito Genovese, always waiting for opportunity, began positioning himself as a potential successor. He whispered to others that Luciano had become careless, too public, too comfortable. "He's forgotten what it means to be invisible," Genovese reportedly said. And in the Mafia, perception was power. Luciano could feel the walls closing in, from the law above and the vultures below. Then, in February 1936, the inevitable happened. Dewey's men arrested Luciano in Hot Springs, Arkansas, after a brief attempt to escape. The king of organized crime was finally in custody. The news exploded across the country. The man who had once ruled the underworld through discipline and design now faced trial as a common criminal. It wasn't just a legal battle, it was a war of narratives. Dewey framed Luciano as the symbol of moral decay, a parasite feeding on the nation's soul. Luciano's defense, led by expert lawyers, tried to portray him as a legitimate businessman falsely accused. But the evidence was overwhelming. The hidden war that had begun in whispers was now raging in full public view. And though Luciano still had friends, money, and influence, he no longer had control. The commission was silent, Lansky was cautious, and Costello, ever pragmatic, began quietly preparing for a future without his old partner at the helm. The system Luciano had built was still standing, but its architect was now isolated. The Mafia's invisible war against the state had become visible, and for the first time, it wasn't clear who would win. Luciano had survived bullets and betrayals, but he was about to learn that the most dangerous weapon in America wasn't a gun. Was the law. Luciano's arrest in 1936 marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would strip away the illusion of invincibility he had so carefully cultivated. 4 years he had walked among politicians, celebrities and businessmen as an equal, the invisible hand guiding the city's criminal economy. Now, shackled and guarded by federal agents, he was paraded before the cameras like a trophy. The same press that once whispered his name in awe now shouted it in headlines, "Vice King Luciano captured." The man who had ruled through silence was suddenly the center of a national spectacle. Inside the underworld, shock gave way to calculation. Some of Luciano's allies feared his downfall would trigger chaos, a return to the bloody power struggles of the past. Others, like Vito Genovese, saw opportunity. With the boss gone, the throne was empty, and ambition filled the void faster than loyalty could contain it. But for now, all eyes were on the courtroom. Thomas E. Dewey was relentless. He framed Luciano's trial as a moral crusade, a chance to show that no man, no matter how powerful, could stand above the law. The charges were grave: running a massive prostitution ring that spanned the city and profited from the exploitation of hundreds of women. Dewey wasn't content to prove Luciano's guilt. He wanted to destroy the myth of the Mafia itself. Each witness, each photograph, each document presented in court was another blow to the empire Luciano had built in the shadows. Luciano's defense was prepared for war. His attorneys argued that he was being framed, that he was a businessman, not a gangster, and certainly not the mastermind of vice. But the witnesses' testimonies painted a brutal picture. Women described beatings, threats, and money flowing up the chain to Luciano's lieutenants. Several confessed that they had never seen Luciano in person, but that his name carried a weight that silenced all dissent. "He was the boss," one said. "You didn't have to see him to know he was watching." For the first time in his life, Luciano was truly vulnerable. His control over the streets meant nothing in the courtroom. He sat quietly during the proceedings, impeccably dressed, occasionally smiling as if the whole thing amused him. But behind that calm demeanor, he understood the reality: this was not a street war he could win with bullets or bribes. Dewey's case had momentum, and momentum was a force even he couldn't stop. Outside the courtroom, public opinion turned against him. Newspapers printed daily updates, depicting Luciano as a symbol of moral decay. Politicians capitalized on the outrage, calling for tougher laws and cleaner cities. For ordinary Americans struggling through the Great Depression, Dewey's campaign against organized crime offered a rare sense of justice. The country needed villains to blame for its corruption, and Luciano fit the role perfectly. Inside the Mafia, loyalties began to shift. Frank Costello, ever pragmatic, tried to stabilize operations from the outside. He maintained communication with Lansky and kept the commission functioning, ensuring that business continued despite the storm. But he also knew that every empire needs a visible leader, and with Luciano's fate uncertain, others were circling. Genovese, always the opportunist, began whispering to allies that Luciano's reign had run its course. "He's finished," he told them. "And a finished man has no friends." Luciano knew Genovese too well to underestimate him. From behind bars, he sent messages to trusted associates, warning them to keep the peace and avoid internal wars. Even in captivity he tried to lead, to preserve the structure he had built. But the longer the trial dragged on, the weaker his authority became. Fear and uncertainty are fatal diseases in the criminal world, and they were spreading fast. In June 1936, after weeks of damning testimony, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. Luciano showed no emotion as the words were read. He had always believed that power came from composure, and he wasn't about to break that rule now. But when the judge sentenced him to 30 to 50 years in state prison, effectively a life sentence, the weight of his empire finally came crashing down. For the first time, lucky Luciano, the man who had reorganized American crime, who had turned chaos into business, was powerless. As he was led away in handcuffs, the cameras flashed like lightning, immortalizing the image of a fallen king. But even in defeat, Luciano refused to disappear. From his cell in Dannemora prison he began to rebuild. He wrote letters, sent coded messages through visitors, and kept a pulse on the streets through Costello and Lansky. "They can lock me up," he reportedly said, "but they can't lock up the commission." The world saw a criminal condemned. The underworld saw something different: a boss who ruled even in chains. And though Dewey celebrated victory, he knew the war wasn't over. He had cut off the head, but the body of organized crime still moved. Luciano's fall was meant to be the end of an era. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new kind of power, one that didn't need to be seen to be felt. Behind prison walls, the mind that built the American Mafia was already adapting, waiting, calculating the next move. Because for Lucky Luciano, survival wasn't just instinct. It was art. The trial of Lucky Luciano in 1936 was unlike anything the American justice system had ever witnessed. It wasn't merely a criminal case, it was theater, politics, and morality all rolled into one. Thomas E. Dewey had transformed the courtroom into a battlefield, and every witness, every exhibit, was another bullet aimed directly at the heart of Luciano's legend. What had once been whispered about in backrooms was now being shouted across headlines. The boss of all bosses, caught and exposed. From the opening statement, Dewey made his strategy clear. He wasn't just prosecuting a man, he was prosecuting an idea, the very notion that organized crime could exist beyond the reach of law. He painted Luciano as a spider at the center of a vast web of vice, using money, fear, and charm to ensnare his victims. He pointed to the prostitution network as proof of his command structure, layers of managers, collectors, and enforcers who funneled profits upward. This man, Dewey declared, pointing directly at Luciano, does not soil his hands with the work. He gives the orders. He profits from the pain of others. Luciano sat still, expressionless. He knew the cameras were watching. His composure was not just pride, it was performance. Every smile, every glance was deliberate. He wanted the jury to see not a monster, but a man in control. Behind that mask, though, he was calculating. Every word of testimony, every reaction from Dewey, every shift in the jury's faces. He studied them all like a gambler reading the table. The prosecution's case rested on testimony from nearly 70 witnesses, most of them women who had worked in the city's brothels. Their stories were devastating. They described a network of fear, pimps and madams who reported to collectors, who in turn sent money to higher-ups, all linked ultimately to Luciano's men. Some of the witnesses were terrified to testify, others spoke with bitterness. They recounted threats, beatings, and extortion. None had ever met Luciano, but his name carried the weight of an empire. The defense, led by attorney George Morton Levy, countered with logic and ridicule. How could the prosecution convict a man on the words of prostitutes and criminals? Where was the direct evidence, the signatures, the money trails, the orders? Levy argued that Dewey's case was built on ambition, not proof. Mr. Dewey wants to make a name for himself, he told the jury. And he has chosen my client as his ladder. But Dewey was meticulous. He had prepared for every defense tactic, every attempt to discredit his witnesses. Piece by piece, he built a narrative of control, one that didn't require Luciano's direct presence. In his closing argument, he said, "The man who gives the orders rarely touches the crime. That is what makes him dangerous." Luciano's calm began to fracture. He was used to controlling outcomes, through money, intimidation, or influence. But in this courtroom, those tools were useless. The jury was not a gang to be bought, nor a union to be swayed. It was a cross-section of ordinary Americans, most of whom had read his name in scandalous headlines for weeks. To them, he wasn't a businessman. He was the face of corruption. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. Crowds gathered daily, cheering for Dewey, booing Luciano's car as it arrived. Newspaper photographers jostled for position, capturing every smirk, every whispered conversation. In the eyes of the public, the trial had become a morality play, America versus the underworld. Luciano's allies tried to intervene quietly. Bribes were offered, threats whispered, witnesses approached. But Dewey's operation was guarded like a fortress. Each attempt only tightened the noose. The judge, Philip McCook, remained firm, refusing to be intimidated. When the defense accused Dewey of grandstanding, the judge replied curtly, "The facts will speak louder than either of you." As the trial neared its end, Dewey called his final witness, a former associate who described in chilling detail how Luciano's orders filtered through the ranks. The courtroom was silent as the man explained how profits were divided, how discipline was enforced, how fear maintained order. Though he never claimed to have heard Luciano give direct commands, his testimony tied the threads together perfectly. It was enough. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Luciano remained motionless, only nodding once as the foreman read the charges. The crowd outside erupted in applause. Inside, Dewey allowed himself a small smile. He had done what no one before him had managed, brought down the most powerful crime boss in America. Judge McCook delivered the sentence with deliberate weight, 30 to 50 years in state prison. The room fell silent. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing history was unfolding before them. Luciano turned to look at his attorneys, then at Dewey. "Well," he said softly, "it was a good show." That line would be quoted in newspapers across the country, part defiance, part acceptance. As he was led away in handcuffs, flashbulbs exploded. The image of Luciano descending the courthouse steps, flanked by officers, became one of the defining photographs of the decade, the fall of a man who had ruled the invisible empire. But for all its finality, the trial's outcome didn't kill the Mafia. In many ways it legitimized it. Dewey had proven its existence, shown the world its structure, and in doing so, gave it mythic stature. The name Lucky Luciano became synonymous with organized crime, not just in America but around the world. For Dewey, the victory propelled him to fame and a political career. For Luciano, it was the beginning of captivity, but not the end of control. Even as he was transferred to Dannemora prison, deep in the mountains near the Canadian border, he was already thinking ahead. He had lost his freedom but not his mind. Luciano understood one thing better than anyone else. Power doesn't vanish when you lose your throne. It only changes form. And soon, from behind bars, he would prove that even in prison, Lucky Luciano was still the boss. When the iron doors of Dannemora prison clanged shut behind him in 1936, the outside world believed they had finally caged America's most dangerous man. Reporters called it the end of the Mafia era. Politicians congratulated Thomas Dewey for restoring moral order. To the public, Lucky Luciano was finished. A relic of a darker age buried alive behind concrete and steel. But inside those walls, the man who had built an empire of order and discipline simply built another one. Dannemora was no ordinary penitentiary. Located near the frigid Canadian border, it was infamous for its brutal winters, violent inmates, and corrupt guards. Most men were broken by it. Luciano adapted. Within weeks of his arrival, he began to map out the prison the way he had once mapped the streets of New York. He identified who controlled what: the guards, the black market suppliers, the smuggling routes that existed even inside confinement. Power, he realized, worked the same way everywhere. The only difference was the scenery. Luciano was patient. He didn't act like a gangster. He acted like a gentleman. He tipped guards, offered quiet advice, and never raised his voice. His charm, the same disarming calm that had won him influence on the outside, worked wonders inside. The guards began calling him Charlie. Some even visited his cell just to talk. One officer later recalled, "He wasn't like the others. You forgot he was an inmate." Soon privileges followed. Luciano's cell was cleaner, his meals better. Visitors came frequently, lawyers, friends, even entertainers. Behind the scenes, messages flowed between Luciano and his old partners, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and the still ambitious Vito Genovese. Officially he was isolated. In reality he was still giving orders. Through intermediaries, Luciano continued to influence the commission. He approved promotions, advised on disputes, and helped maintain the uneasy peace between families. When conflicts threatened to erupt in New York or Chicago, Costello and Lansky consulted him through coded letters disguised as legal correspondence. Every word was measured, every instruction wrapped in layers of subtlety. He ruled through silence, his absence only amplifying his legend. Genovese, who had briefly fled to Italy to avoid prosecution, was still scheming. He believed Luciano's imprisonment had left a vacuum, one he intended to fill. But even from behind bars, Luciano made sure no one rose too high. Rumors spread that those who tried to seize too much power found themselves suddenly unlucky. Luciano's influence had become invisible, yet omnipresent, a ghost guiding the underworld. Meanwhile, Frank Costello emerged as the acting boss, running the organization with a statesman's touch. He cultivated politicians, refined the mob's public image, and avoided unnecessary violence. It was exactly what Luciano wanted: stability. Even Lansky, managing international gambling operations, deferred to Luciano's opinion before making major moves. It was as if the commission operated on the principle of what would Charlie do? But beyond prison politics, history itself was shifting. The 1940s brought war. America's entry into World War II changed everything, including the Mafia's role. The U.S. government, desperate to secure its ports against potential sabotage, quietly turned to unconventional allies. New York's docks, vital to the war effort, were heavily influenced by mob-controlled unions. Naval intelligence needed help, and there was only one man who could deliver it. Enter Operation Underworld. Through intermediaries us officials reached out to Luciano's lawyer. They needed someone who could guarantee labor peace, prevent strikes, and ensure that no German agents infiltrated the shipping lines. Luciano agreed, not for patriotism but for leverage. From behind bars, he coordinated with Costello and Lansky to stabilize the docks. Sabotage incidents vanished overnight. The Mafia, once America's enemy, had suddenly become its silent partner. The deal was unofficial, unacknowledged, but powerful. Luciano's cooperation made its way up to the highest levels of government. And when the Allies began planning the invasion of Sicily in 1943, naval intelligence once again sought Luciano's influence. He provided information about local contacts, smuggling routes, and Sicilian families loyal to the Americans. Whether the details were useful or not, the perception mattered. Luciano was seen as a man whose reach extended across oceans. For the first time since his conviction, he had leverage, and he knew it. From his prison cell, he began a quiet campaign for release. His lawyers argued that his cooperation during the war had been invaluable to national security. Politicians sympathetic to Costello began whispering about clemency. Publicly, the state refused to acknowledge any deal, but privately, doors were opening. In 1945, as the war drew to a close, Governor Thomas Dewey, the very man who had sent Luciano to prison, faced a moral and political dilemma. Luciano's contributions to Operation Underworld were undeniable, but releasing him could appear like a betrayal of justice. Still, pressure mounted from influential businessmen and government officials. They argued that Luciano had served his country. In early 1946, the decision was made. Dewey commuted Luciano's sentence on the condition that he be deported to Italy immediately after his release. The arrangement was discreet, buried under bureaucratic phrasing. Officially it was mercy. In truth it was politics. On February 9, 1946, after nearly 10 years in prison, Lucky Luciano walked free. He was thinner, older, but his eyes still carried the same calm intelligence. As reporters shouted questions, he offered only one line: "I did what I had to do for my country." 2 days later, he boarded a ship to Italy under heavy guard. The man who had ruled New York's underworld, who had built the commission, who had survived betrayal, trial, and imprisonment, was gone from America. But his influence remained like an echo. The streets he once ruled were still run by his men. The system he designed was still intact. From the depths of Dannemora's isolation, Luciano had done what no gangster before him had ever achieved. He had turned a life sentence into a negotiation. He had proven that power doesn't disappear when you're locked away, it simply evolves. And though the world believed his story had ended, Luciano's exile would only open the next act. One filled with ghosts of the past, old enemies reborn, and the slow unraveling of a man who had once controlled the underworld like a chessboard. When Lucky Luciano stepped off the ship in Naples in 1946, the Mediterranean sun hit his face like a reminder that freedom had a price. He was technically a free man, but exiled from the empire he had built. The streets of New York, the smoke-filled backrooms, the rhythm of a city that had once obeyed his every signal. Italy was supposed to be home, yet to him, it felt like a foreign prison with better weather. He arrived in a nation struggling to rebuild after the devastation of World War II. The cities were scarred, the economy was in ruins, and the old Sicilian families were trying to reclaim their lost dominance. Luciano, ever the strategist, saw both opportunity and danger. Though deported as a criminal, he was received by many Italians as a legend. Il Padrino Americano, the man who had tamed the chaos of American crime and turned it into a disciplined system. Young mafiosi sought him out, eager to learn the ways of the modern mafia. But Luciano was careful. He knew the eyes of the world, and the American government, were still watching him. He was under constant surveillance by both Italian authorities and U.S. agents. Every meeting, every letter, every phone call was recorded or reported. He couldn't openly return to crime, but the temptation to influence, to remain relevant, was irresistible. Naples became his base, but his reach extended far beyond it. Through secret couriers and coded letters, he maintained contact with Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, who continued to manage operations in the United States and Cuba. Together, they began exploring new avenues for profit, particularly the lucrative post-war drug trade. Heroin production in Europe was on the rise, and with the chaos of war-torn borders, smuggling routes were easier than ever to exploit. Luciano's connections in Sicily and Marseille positioned him perfectly to oversee the early foundations of what would later become the French Connection. Officially, he denied involvement. Unofficially, he was the silent architect. American authorities suspected as much, but evidence was scarce. Luciano was too smart to leave a trail, and too proud to let go completely. In the early 1950s, he shifted his operations to Cuba, where his old friend Lansky had built a gambling paradise under the indulgent eye of Fulgencio Batista. Havana was a glittering world of money, music, and vice, and for a brief moment, it seemed like Luciano had found his second empire. He arrived in 1947 under a false passport, blending into the island's high society while quietly meeting with mob figures from across America. The Havana Conference of 1946-47 would become infamous, an unprecedented gathering of mafia leaders discussing territories, narcotics, and the future of organized crime. At the center of it all sat Lucky Luciano, calm, confident, and back in command. For one night it felt like the old days. But power has a way of drawing light. When U.S. newspapers broke the story of his presence in Havana, public outrage erupted. Washington demanded his removal. Within weeks, Cuban authorities, under U.S. pressure, arrested him and deported him back to Italy. Luciano had tasted his old world one last time, only to lose it again. Back in Naples he grew older, restless, and increasingly reflective. The criminal networks he had helped build no longer needed him. The new generation, men like Vito Genovese who had returned from Italy and seized control of New York's underworld, operated with less finesse, more violence. The business had changed. Luciano, once the visionary of modern organized crime, was now its ghost, respected but irrelevant. He spent his final years in a quiet villa outside Naples, living modestly but always surrounded by whispers. He walked the beaches alone, smoked his cigars, and met occasionally with old associates who sought his blessing or advice. To some, he was still the chairman. To others, he was a relic of another time. In 1962, at age 64, Luciano arranged a meeting with an American film producer who wanted to make a movie about his life. He saw it as a chance to control his own story, to shape his legacy rather than let others define it. But fate intervened. As he waited outside the Naples airport after greeting the producer, Luciano suddenly collapsed. A heart attack struck him down instantly. The man who had lived through wars, betrayals, assassinations, and prisons, who had outmaneuvered the law and ruled 2 continents of crime, died on a sidewalk, his hat rolling beside him. Thousands attended his funeral. Some were gangsters, others admirers, and a few were simply curious. His body was eventually transported back to the United States, buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, the same soil that had once trembled beneath his command. Lucky Luciano's exile had been a paradox. Freedom without home, power without territory, respect without peace. Yet even in death, his influence lingered. The structure he had created, the Commission, still governed the Mafia for decades. His name became legend, half myth, half truth, a symbol of the delicate balance between loyalty and ambition. He had once said, "There's no such thing as good money or bad money. There's just money." But in exile he discovered something he could never buy: belonging. Lucky Luciano's death marked the end of an era, but his legacy refused to die. It seeped through every corner of organized crime, from the backrooms of Las Vegas casinos to the narrow alleys of Palermo. Even decades later, law enforcement agents, criminologists, and historians still spoke his name with a strange mix of awe and unease. Because Luciano hadn't just built a criminal empire, he had created a system, one that turned chaos into order and brutality into business. Before Luciano, the Mafia was fractured, small, local, ruled by hot-headed gangsters driven by pride and vengeance. After Luciano, it became an institution, disciplined, structured, and frighteningly rational. He replaced the old world's emotional code of vendetta with something far more efficient: a corporate model. The Commission, his masterpiece, was the Mafia's version of a board of directors. It turned criminals into businessmen and businessmen into criminals. It imposed hierarchy where there had been anarchy. And even after his death, it continued to govern organized crime with an iron logic he had first imagined. By the 1950s and 60s, Luciano's blueprint could be seen everywhere. The 5 families of New York, Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese, operated under the very rules he had set. Every major decision required approval from the Commission. Violence was regulated, disputes were mediated, and territories were respected. For a time, it gave the Mafia a kind of invisible peace, a structure that allowed it to grow into a global network worth billions. But the world changed faster than Luciano could have imagined. Television exposed what the underworld had always hidden. The FBI, once disorganized and reactive, began to adapt. Wiretaps, surveillance, and undercover operations transformed law enforcement. The illusion of secrecy, the foundation of Luciano's code, started to crumble. The very system he had designed to survive any one man began to corrode under the weight of its own success. Still, Luciano's influence extended beyond crime. His model of organization, decentralized yet cooperative, inspired everything from drug cartels to corporate monopolies. He showed that power could exist without a crown, that leadership was not about being seen but about being obeyed. In many ways he foreshadowed the modern world, global, connected, ruthless, efficient. Psychologically, Luciano's genius lay in his understanding of people. He knew that fear could control men, but respect could own them. His calm demeanor, his ability to listen, his preference for negotiation over bloodshed, these traits made him unlike the gangsters who came before him. He didn't crave chaos, he craved control. In that sense, he was less a criminal and more a social engineer, someone who built a system to manage human greed itself. Yet his legacy was a paradox. The order he built out of violence ultimately preserved violence. His rules, though rational, still protected killers. His commission, meant to prevent senseless wars, became a council of predators deciding who lived and who died. Luciano's moral detachment, his ability to see crime as just business, became the ethical shield for countless atrocities. In building the mafia structure, he had also built a moral vacuum. And yet, historians often can't help but admire him. They see a man who rose from the slums of Sicily, crossed an ocean with nothing, and rewrote the underworld's laws. They see a mind that could have built empires in any industry, finance, politics, diplomacy, if only it had been born into legitimacy. Even his enemies admitted it. Luciano wasn't just another gangster. He was civilization's dark reflection. A man who used intelligence and organization for immoral ends, proving that intellect without conscience can be more dangerous than violence itself. Culturally, he became myth. Books, films, and television shows reimagined him as a tragic anti-hero, the street boy who became a king, the visionary trapped in a world of crime. From The Godfather to Boardwalk Empire, the DNA of Luciano's story runs deep. Every fictional mob boss who preaches loyalty, who governs through quiet menace, who insists on business over emotion, carries a shadow of Lucky Luciano. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of his legacy is how normal he made it all seem. By turning crime into an enterprise, he blurred the line between the legal and the illegal, between corporate corruption and street extortion. The mafia no longer looked like outlaws, they looked like men in suits, shaking hands over contracts instead of corpses. Luciano didn't just build the mafia. He built the illusion of legitimacy that would allow organized crime to thrive for generations. And in a strange way, that illusion still lives on. Whenever power hides behind respectability, whenever institutions protect the corrupt under the guise of order, the ghost of Luciano is there, whispering from the shadows that systems can justify anything if built cleverly enough. Lucky Luciano once said, "There's no such thing as organized crime, just organized people." He was right. His greatest trick wasn't creating criminals, it was creating order out of greed. And that, perhaps, is why his name endures. Because he wasn't just the man who built the American Mafia. He was the man who taught the modern world how to disguise sin as structure. In the end, the story of Lucky Luciano is not just about crime, it's about power, transformation, and the unrelenting human hunger for control. His life reads like a parable of the 20th century. A man born in poverty who rose to unimaginable influence, who replaced the brute force of the old world with the intellect of the new. Yet beneath all his sophistication, his empire was built on the same foundations as any tyranny: fear, loyalty, and silence. As the credits of his life rolled, the world Luciano had once mastered was already evolving into something he could barely recognize. The 1960s brought a new kind of rebellion, against authority, against conformity, against institutions. And while the mafia still thrived in the shadows, the myth of its invincibility began to crack. The same system of loyalty Luciano had built was eroding under greed and paranoia. Younger mobsters, hungrier and less disciplined, no longer believed in the old codes. Violence replaced diplomacy. The commission, once the symbol of balance and order, became a battlefield of ambition. Law enforcement, too, had changed. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, once hesitant to even admit the mafia existed, now pursued it with precision. Luciano's organizational genius, once his greatest advantage, became a liability, because the very structure that made the mafia efficient also made it traceable. In a way, Luciano had created a perfect system for his enemies to eventually dismantle. Still, his shadow lingered. Even as the mafia began to fracture, its members continued to invoke his name. To them, Luciano wasn't just history, he was the blueprint. The calm authority, the businesslike demeanor, the belief that power could exist quietly, all of it came from him. To study the mafia without understanding Luciano is like studying modern politics without understanding Machiavelli. But to see Luciano only as a criminal mastermind is to miss the deeper story. Beneath the violence and ambition was a man shaped by his time, an immigrant who arrived in America with nothing, who watched the city divide itself by class and opportunity, who realized early on that the rules of the powerful were different from the rules of the poor. Luciano simply decided to play by the powerful's rules, he just did it from the wrong side of the law. There's a strange kind of morality in that. He never saw himself as evil. In his mind, he provided structure where chaos reigned. He believed in fairness, even if his fairness was built on blood. To those who betrayed him, punishment was inevitable. To those who were loyal, he offered protection and prosperity. His moral compass wasn't broken, it was rewired, tuned not to justice but to balance. That's what makes his story so enduring. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What separates a visionary from a villain? When does order become oppression? Can intelligence justify immorality if the result is stability? Luciano's life sits at that intersection, where ethics and power collide, where the line between leadership and manipulation blurs. In the years following his death, the world continued to glamorize the mafia he helped shape. Films, novels, and documentaries turned mobsters into philosophers of the street, men who spoke about loyalty and honor as if they were poets of the underworld. But the truth behind the myth remained cold. Every handshake was a transaction, every oath a chain. Luciano had shown that power built on fear could last a lifetime, but never forever. His death in Naples may have seemed quiet, almost poetic, but the echo of his legacy was anything but. The institutions of organized crime he left behind became international syndicates. The drug trade expanded beyond anything he could have imagined. Governments, corporations, and shadow networks began to mirror the same principles he'd once imposed on the mafia: hierarchy, discipline, plausible deniability. The criminal mind had gone global, and in many ways it still spoke his language. And yet, there's a certain melancholy that lingers in the idea of Lucky Luciano, a man who achieved everything but could never truly belong anywhere. He had conquered the American underworld, yet died in exile. He had sought control, yet spent his final years watching a world he no longer controlled. His genius gave him power, but his power stripped him of peace. Today, historians debate his motives, criminologists study his methods, and filmmakers romanticize his image. But to understand Luciano is to understand the dark side of ambition itself, the belief that order can justify anything, that control is worth more than conscience. As the world changes and the line between the legal and the illegal continues to blur, Luciano's story remains eerily relevant. He was the first to show that corruption doesn't always come with a gun. Sometimes it comes with a handshake, a smile, and a promise of business. And so, the curtain falls on Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the street kid who built an empire, the criminal who thought like a statesman, the exile who became immortal. His empire may have faded, but the lesson of his life endures, that every system, no matter how powerful, is born from human weakness, and that even in the underworld, it is not violence that rules but vision.